Everyone recognize this model of a railroad? It's the Pegleg, a one-legged railroad that ran through Bradford to Derrick City. It's also called the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railroad. But if you're a railroad nut, did I say nut? I meant railroad enthusiast. If you're a railroad enthusiast, you already know that. Well, today we're going to learn about the history of the Pegleg, the one-legged railroad that became famous, not just because it was only here for 2 years, but because of its unusual system of running on one rail. A one-legged railroad. Who knew? Join us for Coffee with the Curator. This is without a doubt the most famous photograph of the Pegleg Railroad. It's been reproduced many times, and I believe a picture of it hangs on the wall of the Bradford Club. Now, the Articles of Association for the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railroad were signed in 1877, and there are some interesting things in the wording of that agreement. First of all, it said, of course, the name of the company shall be the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railway Company. Second, and this is the unbelievable part, the company shall exist for 99 years. Well, they didn't make 99 years, they made 3. Well, what exactly was the Pegleg Railroad? Well, it was a monorail, and it's got its name because it ran on one rail. Back in those days, there were still Civil War veterans around with one leg. They were called Peglegs, so the railroad got its name that way. Personally, I've often wondered who thought it was a good idea to have a railroad run on one rail. I mean, this is McKean County, and the land is not exactly flat. But it turned out that the original organizers of the railroad had been to the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876 and had seen that monorail on exhibit there and realized it would work in Pennsylvania. In 1876, Bradford was in the middle of an oil boom, and there was lots of machinery and oil well supplies needing to be delivered. The organizers of the railroad felt that it would be profitable to have a railroad like this to deliver oil well supplies to the oil fields, bypassing the muddy roads and hilly terrain. They decided the time was right and built a railroad patterned after the one seen at the Philadelphia Exposition. They raised $40,000 from capitalists, and the project was underway. This is a photograph of the first engine on the Pegleg Railroad, number 1. It was built by the LaFrance Company in Elmira, New York, and served the monorail pretty well for the first couple of months. It had 2 flat cars, and you can see some men in the back, open flat cars. Each car could carry 35 people, but it often carried more. People have been fascinated by the Pegleg ever since it was built, and especially after it blew up. The Landmark Society has 2 models of the Pegleg Railroad that were built years ago. This particular model was built by William Bailey about 1895. It's in the collection here at the Landmark Society. In 1878, another engine was bought for the Pegleg Railroad. This one, engine number 2, was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It was feared that it was top-heavy. It was about 6 tons overweight, and on one of its trips leaving Bradford, it made it as far as the Tuna Creek before one of the heavy timbers supporting it gave way, and the little locomotive tipped on its side, throwing its passengers into the creek. No one was particularly hurt, and the engine never actually hit the creek itself, so it was hauled back up onto the rail and continued for several more months. But eventually, the third engine, the one that would blow up on the Pegleg Railroad, would arrive. This is a photograph of engine number 2 in that accident where it tipped off the rails. Engine number 2 on the Pegleg Railroad operated for some time, but eventually it was replaced by engine number 3, and there are no photographs of this locomotive. It's referred sometimes as the mystery locomotive. It was built in Titusville, and it came to Bradford in January of 1879. Now, this silhouette sketch of a railroad locomotive does not really look like engine number 3. No one knows exactly what it looked like, but this is probably not it. This is just a representation of an engine, so that you can follow the story. They took it out for its inaugural trip on January 27th of 1879. 11 men went along. It was January, of course. 5 o'clock in the night, it's dark, it's snowing, and for some reason they decided that was the perfect time to take the trip to Derrick City and try out the new engine number 3. Needless to say, it was the last run the Pegleg ever made. But why? Why did engine number 3 blow up on that trial run? Well, I'm going to read you some excerpts from a book written about the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railroad. And it says, "A reporter sought out Mr. Allen, superintendent of the elevated road, at a late hour last night, and he consented to give a statement of the unfortunate accident as far as his knowledge went. Mr. Allen said, 'I came up from Titusville this afternoon. The engine was on the track and it had run up and down a few times. I got on the engine, and at the engine house we hitched on a flat car for the purpose of hauling some stuff for the mill. A number of people wanted a ride, but I objected, for fear some accident might happen, no kidding, before the engine was fully tested, and then I would be damned for it. We left Bradford at nearly 5 o'clock and ran very slowly. The safety valve, which was set at 80 pounds, constantly blowed off steam most of the way going up. At Fosterbrook, we had considerable difficulty in getting the drawbridge over the wagon road shut, so that the steam had run down considerably when we started to go uphill. At that time there was on the flat car beside myself John Addis, a trackman, temporarily acting as brakeman, Charlie Shepard, R.H. Sterrett, John Vaughan, a machinist, Mike Holleran, George Grogan, and the conductor Al Garsides. After starting up the grade, which is quite heavy, the engine stopped. I asked what was the matter, and one of the men said the nut which held the handle on the throttle valve had come loose, and steam oozed so badly that it burned the engineer's hand. It was at this time after dark I asked Johnny, the foreman, how the steam was, and he said very low. They tried to start the engine but couldn't. The steam had ceased to blow off. A moment after I asked how low the water was, and my supposition is that the fireman, being a new hand, opened the injector, which was a powerful one, and let a lot of cold water in suddenly. In the meantime, the engineer was trying to start the engine, and while it stood there, the right-hand boiler towards the narrow gauge road suddenly exploded with a terrific noise. The next thing I knew, I was under the flat car. I crawled out and found I had not received the slightest injury. But Addis, who had stood within 2 feet of me, was instantly killed. In all, 6 men were killed, and several others suffered from shock and injuries, such as broken legs and broken arms. This disastrous accident brought to a close the brief but colorful life of the Pegleg Railroad. A month later, it was sold at a sheriff's sale. Some people hoped that it would be rebuilt and put back online, but it never was. It was the end of the elevated railroad, one of the first monorails in the United States. The Pegleg was history, but it lives on in legend in the Bradford area. This float was designed for the 1909 Old Home Week parade in Bradford in August of that year. And it's believed that that crumpled funnel on the front of the float is actually the smokestack from number 3 locomotive that blew up in 1879. If you're interested in learning more about the Pegleg Railroad, I can suggest one of these 2 books. The one on the left is called The Bradford and Fosterbrook Pegleg Railroad. It was written by Lawrence Kilmer around 1971, and not only covers the Pegleg, but several other railroads as well. It's a very in-depth reporting of the accident, and I think you'd be very interested to read it. The one on the right, Death by Train, horrifying yet true stories of train wrecks and accidents, was written by the Bradford Landmark 7 years ago. It covers dozens of train wrecks and accidents, all in horrifying detail. We literally reprinted the exact story that appeared in the newspapers about these accidents. Now, all the stories in this particular book, Death by Train, are similar. The Bradford era and other newspapers delighted in making details almost as gory as possible so that they could attract readership. The Pegleg section in this book not only contains the accident, but it also contains the coroner's report of what exactly happened. Pretty good stuff. And whether you are a railroad enthusiast or a railroad nut, the history of the Pegleg Railroad is a part of Bradford history that cannot be ignored or forgotten.